The 82nd Airborne at Normandy, June 1944. Paratroopers scattered across the French countryside in darkness, forming small groups to fight behind German lines. Personal stories of confusion, improvisation, and bravery.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, I want to tell you about one of the most chaotic and courageous operations of World War II. It happened in the darkness before D-Day, when thousands of American paratroopers jumped into occupied France with one mission: cause as much confusion as possible behind German lines before the beach landings began at dawn. This is the story of the 82nd Airborne Division in Normandy, June 6, 1944. Most people know about D-Day from the famous images: landing craft hitting the beaches, soldiers wading through the surf under heavy fire. But what many don't know is that hours before those beach landings, in the middle of the night, American paratroopers were already on the ground in France, fighting their own desperate battles in the darkness. The plan looked good on paper. The 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne would drop inland from the beaches in the early hours of June 6th. Their job was to secure key roads, bridges, and towns to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. They'd capture strategic positions, blow up bridges, and create chaos in the German rear areas. Simple, right? Drop in, complete your objectives, link up with the troops coming from the beaches. The whole operation was supposed to be quick and coordinated. But war rarely goes according to plan, and what happened that night became one of the most confusing, improvised, and ultimately heroic operations in American military history. Let me take you back to the evening of June 5, 1944. In air bases across southern England, paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne are getting ready. These are young men, most of them in their late teens or early 20s. They're from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college kids from California. They've been training for months, but nobody really knows what to expect. They're about to jump into occupied territory in the middle of the night, into an area crawling with German troops. Each man is carrying over 100 pounds of equipment: parachute, reserve chute, rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, medical supplies. Private First Class John Steele from North Carolina later described the scene. "We were so loaded down with gear we could barely walk. They had to help us into the planes. Guys were making jokes, trying to keep the mood light, but you could see it in everyone's eyes. We were scared. We knew some of us weren't coming back."
The planes took off around 11 p.m. Over 800 C-47 transport planes, each carrying about 20 paratroopers. The formations stretched for miles across the night sky. Inside the planes, it was loud, cramped, and tense. Some men tried to sleep. Others prayed. Some just sat in silence, lost in their thoughts. As they crossed the English Channel and approached the French coast, the pilots flew low to avoid German radar. The planes bounced and shook in the turbulent air. Men who'd never been airsick in training suddenly felt their stomachs turning. Then they hit the coast of France, and everything went wrong. The German anti-aircraft fire was far heavier than expected. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky. Flak explosions rocked the planes. Pilots took evasive action, breaking formation, climbing, diving, turning to avoid the fire. Inside the planes, paratroopers were thrown around like rag dolls. Sergeant Ray Eibischer from Wisconsin remembered, "The plane was shaking so badly I thought we were going to crash. Then the pilot started taking evasive maneuvers and we were all slamming into each other. The jump master was yelling, 'Stand up, hook up,' but half the guys couldn't even get to their feet." In the chaos, pilots dropped paratroopers wherever they could. Some dropped them too early, some too late. Some planes were hit and went down. Others scattered their troops across miles of French countryside. The carefully planned drop zones were forgotten. Paratroopers jumped into the darkness, not knowing where they were or where they'd land. Private Ed Buckafogli from New York described his jump. "I stepped out into nothing. Pure darkness. I could hear explosions, see tracer fire. My chute opened, and suddenly everything was quiet except for the wind. I was floating down into enemy territory, and I had no idea where I was going to land." And that's when the real confusion began. Paratroopers landed everywhere. In fields, in trees, in swamps, on roads, in villages. Some landed right on top of German positions. Others landed miles from where they were supposed to be. The entire operation scattered across hundreds of square miles of Norman countryside. Private John Fitzgerald from Massachusetts landed in a tree 30 feet off the ground. He hung there for 2 hours, afraid to make noise and attract German attention, slowly cutting himself down with his knife. When he finally reached the ground, he had no idea where he was.
Staff Sergeant Leonard Liebenson from Pennsylvania landed in the middle of a German camp. He hit the ground, saw German soldiers 20 yards away, and just started running. He ran through the darkness until his lungs burned, finally collapsing in a ditch miles away. Private Robert Murphy from Ohio landed in a flooded area. The Germans had flooded many of the fields as a defensive measure. Murphy landed in 4 feet of water, weighed down by over 100 pounds of equipment. He nearly drowned trying to get out of his parachute harness. He survived, but many others in those flooded zones didn't. They drowned in the darkness, trapped by their own equipment. Now, imagine this. You're a 19-year-old kid from Kansas. You've just jumped out of a plane in the middle of the night. You landed in a field somewhere in France. You have no idea where you are. You can hear gunfire in the distance. You know there are German soldiers nearby. And you're completely alone. This was the reality for thousands of American paratroopers that night. The units that were supposed to drop together were scattered across miles of countryside. Squads were broken up. Platoons were missing half their men. Company commanders couldn't find their companies. Battalion headquarters had no idea where their battalions were. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because instead of panicking, instead of hiding and waiting for dawn, these young Americans did something remarkable. They started improvising. The 82nd Airborne had trained for this possibility. Every paratrooper carried a small metal clicker. It made a distinctive click-clack sound. The idea was simple. If you heard someone in the darkness, you clicked once. If they were American, they'd click back twice. It was a way to identify each other without speaking and giving away your position. In the darkness of that June night, all across Normandy, you could hear these little clicks. Click-clack, click-clack-clack. American paratroopers finding each other, forming small groups, organizing themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed miles from his drop zone. He had no radio contact with his battalion. He had no idea where most of his men were. So he did what paratroopers do. He gathered whoever he could find and started moving toward his objective. He ended up with about 20 men, none of them from his battalion. They were from different companies, different regiments, even different divisions, but they were all paratroopers, and they all had a job to do. Krauss organized them into a fighting unit and headed for the town of Saint-Mère-Église, one of the key objectives. This same scene played out hundreds of times that night. Small groups of paratroopers, 5 men, 10 men, 20 men, coming together in the darkness. Officers taking command of whoever they could find. Sergeants leading men they'd never met before. And somehow, despite the chaos, they started accomplishing their missions. Private Joe Barely from Michigan landed alone and spent hours trying to find other Americans. He came across a German patrol and had to hide in a ditch while they passed within feet of him. Finally, he found 3 other paratroopers. They didn't know each other, but they worked together to take out a German machine gun position that was covering a key road. The thing is, the chaos actually worked in the Americans' favor in an unexpected way. The Germans were completely confused. They were getting reports of American paratroopers everywhere, north, south, east, west, small groups attacking from unexpected directions. Explosions and gunfire scattered across the entire region. The Germans had no idea how many Americans had dropped or where they were concentrated. It created exactly the kind of confusion and chaos the operation was supposed to create. One of the most famous actions that night involved the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. This small Norman town was a key objective because several roads intersected there. The Germans had troops stationed in and around the town. Lieutenant Colonel Krauss and his makeshift force approached the town around 4:30 a.m. They could hear shooting. It turned out other paratroopers had already landed in and around the town and were fighting the Germans. Some had even landed right in the church square. Private John Steele, the paratrooper I mentioned earlier, actually landed on the church steeple and hung there for hours, playing dead while the battle raged below him. Krauss's group attacked from one side, while other small groups of paratroopers attacked from other directions. The fighting was brutal, house to house, room to room. But by dawn, the Americans controlled Sainte-Mère-Église. It was the first French town liberated on D-Day. Krauss personally raised an American flag on the town hall, a flag he'd carried with him, the same flag that had flown over Naples when the 92nd helped liberate that city. But for every success story, there were tragedies. Not every paratrooper found friends in the darkness. Not every group accomplished their mission. The casualties were heavy. Private First Class Frank Lillyman from Massachusetts was part of a Pathfinder team. These were the first men to jump, whose job was to set up lights and radios to guide in the main force. His team was scattered on the drop. He landed alone and spent the entire night trying to complete his mission by himself, setting up navigation beacons while dodging German patrols. Sergeant Leonard Funk from Pennsylvania landed in a tree and broke his leg. He couldn't walk, couldn't move. He sat there in that tree for 8 hours, in pain, listening to the sounds of battle all around him, until other paratroopers finally found him after dawn.
Some paratroopers landed right in the middle of German strongpoints and were killed before they could even get out of their parachutes. Others landed in the flooded zones and drowned. Some were captured immediately. The 82nd Airborne suffered over 1,200 casualties in the first 24 hours, killed, wounded, or missing. But despite the chaos, despite the casualties, the paratroopers accomplished their mission. They didn't take all their objectives exactly as planned, but they did something more important. They created havoc behind German lines. They cut communications, they blocked roads, they ambushed reinforcements, and they prevented German units from effectively responding to the beach landings. When the sun rose on June 6th and the beach landings began, German commanders were still trying to figure out what was happening inland. Were there hundreds of paratroopers? Thousands? Where were they? What were they doing? The confusion the scattered drops created became one of the operation's greatest assets. By the afternoon of June 6th, American troops from the beaches were pushing inland and linking up with the paratroopers. The men of the 82nd, who'd been fighting isolated actions all night and morning, finally got reinforcements, supplies, and support. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne, later walked through the areas where his men had landed. He saw the evidence of dozens of small battles, burned equipment, destroyed German vehicles, hastily dug foxholes. He talked to his soldiers and heard their stories. He later wrote, "Every man who jumped that night was a hero. They jumped into darkness and uncertainty. They landed scattered and alone. But they found each other, organized themselves, and fought like veterans. I've never been more proud of American soldiers." The stories that came out of that night became legendary in the 82nd Airborne. There was Sergeant Ray, who landed alone, captured a German machine gun position by himself, and held it until other Americans arrived. There was Lieutenant Waverly Ray,
who single-handedly took out a German command post, killing or capturing over a dozen enemy soldiers. There was Private Leo Hart, who, despite being wounded in the drop, fought for 12 hours straight before finally accepting medical treatment. But it wasn't just about individual heroics. It was about something deeper, the ability to adapt, to improvise, to accomplish the mission even when everything goes wrong. These young Americans, most of whom had never been in combat before, showed incredible initiative and courage. Think about what they did. They jumped out of planes in the middle of the night into enemy territory. They landed scattered and confused. They had no way to contact their commanders. Many had lost their equipment. They were surrounded by enemy forces. And yet they didn't hide, didn't surrender, didn't wait to be rescued. They found each other, formed units, and attacked.
That's the American soldier. Not perfect, not invincible, but adaptable and determined. When the plan fell apart, they made a new plan. When they couldn't find their unit, they found other soldiers and formed new units. When they didn't have the right equipment, they used what they had. They improvised, adapted, and overcame. The 82nd Airborne would go on to fight across Europe, in Holland during Operation Market Garden, in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge, and finally into Germany itself. But for many veterans, nothing compared to that first night in Normandy. That night when everything went wrong, and they had to rely on their training, their courage, and each other. Private First Class Dwayne Burns from Tennessee, who jumped that night, later said, "We were just kids, really. Most of us had never been away from home before joining the Army. But that night, we became men. We became soldiers. We learned that we could handle anything if we stuck together." The D-Day landing succeeded for many reasons: the bravery of the men on the beaches, the naval bombardment, the air support, the planning and logistics. But the paratroopers played a crucial role. They disrupted German defenses. They secured key positions. They created chaos and confusion at exactly the right time. And they did it under the worst possible circumstances. Scattered, disorganized, fighting in small groups in the darkness against an enemy that knew the terrain and had prepared defenses. Today, when you see images of D-Day, remember that hours before those beach landings, American paratroopers were already fighting and dying in the Norman countryside. Remember the young men who jumped into darkness, not knowing where they'd land or if they'd survive. Remember the small groups of soldiers who found each other with cricket clickers and formed instant bonds of brotherhood. Remember the officers who led men they'd never met before. Remember the privates who showed initiative that would make generals proud. The 82nd Airborne's jump into Normandy wasn't the perfectly executed operation the planners hoped for. It was chaotic, scattered, and improvised. But in the end, it worked. Because when American soldiers are trained well, led well, and given a mission, they find a way to accomplish it even when everything goes wrong. That's the lesson of June 6, 1944. That's the story of the 82nd Airborne in Normandy. Not a story of perfect execution, but of courage, improvisation, and determination in the face of chaos. Thank you for listening, and never forget what those young Americans did that night. June 1944. More than 13,000 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped into darkness that night. Many never reached their drop zones. Many never saw the sunrise. Some drowned in flooded fields, tangled in their parachutes. Others were shot before their boots even touched the ground. By dawn, hundreds lay dead across the hedgerows of Normandy. Boys who just days before were laughing,
writing letters home, talking about what they'd do after the war. Some were never found, their names carved into white stone on foreign soil, rows and rows of crosses stretching farther than the eye can see, each one a story that ended too soon. War is not glory. It's not the sound of drums or the waving of flags. It's mud, fear, and silence, the silence after a scream. It's mothers who never saw their sons again. It's children who grew up without fathers. And the men who send others to fight, they never jump from planes. They never crawl through the mud or hold a dying friend's hand. They sit safe, miles away, and call it strategy. But those who fought here, they called it hell. So when you see the beaches of Normandy, remember what it cost. Remember the young men who traded everything they had for a chance at a better world. They didn't fight for medals or speeches. They fought for each other. And that's the only kind of heroism that truly matters.